Hi there everyone! Welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Cartesian Interactionism. So what we've covered up to this point in class is that Descartes is a dualist, which means that he believes that there are two distinct classes of finite substances, namely bodies or extended substances and minds or thinking substances. In this video, we're going to explore a related doctrine of Descartes, namely his interactionism, his belief that your body as a substance can come to affect your mind as a substance, and your mind as a substance can come to affect your body. One way that Descartes' philosophy can seem a little alienating to us if we think about it for too long is that we ordinarily think about ourselves as human beings, that is, minded bodies or bodies with minds. We don't normally think about ourselves as composed of two completely independent components, namely the body on the one hand and the mind on the other. But that's exactly what is demanded by Descartes' philosophy. In this video, we're going to explore how Descartes thought about how that interaction worked, as well as two critics of Descartes' view, namely Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia and Anton Wilhelm Amo. Now, as I mentioned, interactionism is the view that minds and bodies are distinct substances that causally interact with one another. So your mind can affect what happens with your body. Your mind can tell your body, as it were, to do certain things. For example, to raise your right hand, right? And similarly, your body can come to have a causal impact on your mind. Right? This is especially evident whenever you feel a powerful emotion, for example. That's a physiological, biological process. We can observe various features of it. For example, if you're embarrassed, blushing, right, the reddening of the flesh, and so on. And you can give an even deeper explanation of that in virtue of your blood flow and so on, right? And this bodily interaction comes to have an effect on our mind, right? We feel frazzled, as it were. Descartes' interactionism is his attempt to explain how it is that these interactions take place, because it can seem that Descartes has described bodies and minds as so fundamentally different that it becomes very, very difficult or even impossible to see how they're part of the same world, or how it is that bodies and minds can come to interact with one another. So, as we mentioned, the two sort of test cases that we need to examine, which will be challenged by Princess Elisabeth and Amo respectively, are voluntary actions and passions, body-to-mind interactions, as well as mind-to-body interactions. Now, it's a little bit difficult to get Descartes' picture of this from the Meditations. If I had my way and I could make early modern philosophy like a 2-semester course and keep you all well into the next semester and so on, then I would have us read The Passions of the Soul, which is a book-length, just is a book that Descartes wrote explicitly to address this issue. It's his theory about human emotions, the body, and explicitly provides an account of mind-body relationships. So part of why our picture of how Descartes thinks all this stuff works is going to be a little bit poor. It's just that we have to focus the limited time that we have on the Meditations instead of this longer work that is more focused on questions regarding human emotions as well as the body-specific relationship and effect on the mind. But in essence, what that book argues is the following. Descartes maintains in The Passions of the Soul that your mind is in the pineal gland of your brain, right? The pineal gland is just like a particular part of the brain. It turns out that Descartes was not correct in terms of, locating all of our consciousness and so on in this portion of the brain. Neuroscience has discovered that hypothesis is false. Nevertheless, Descartes did have at least decent reason for thinking that the pineal gland was where the soul or the mind was located, because it's part of the brain that is not mirrored, right? You have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere of your brain, and your pineal gland is right into the center. So Descartes thought of it as almost like the control tower, if you will, of your body. Now, Descartes' account really is that your mind can affect this pineal gland, right? It's located within the pineal gland, and whenever you desire to have a voluntary action, for example, to raise your right hand, what goes on is that the mind sends what Descartes called animal spirits. Now, that's old-timey terminology, but he was kind of right in a certain way. Not that it was animal spirits, but that your brain sends electric signals, right, through your blood to tense or untense, as it were, your muscles, right? That's what's going on. That's what makes it possible, for example, for you to raise your hand on Descartes' account, is that the mind sends these electrical signals that he called animal spirits from your brain through your blood into your muscles that can produce the desired physical effect. Now, similarly, parts of your body send these electrical signals or animal spirits back to your brain, where these electrical signals are processed and they come to acquire a meaning. That is, for example, Descartes' account of what happens in sensory perception, right? Various sensory components of your body, whether it be your eyes, your nose, your ears, your skin, your tongue, and so on, send certain signals that then are eventually interpreted in your brain by your mind, right? And so in this way, Descartes had actually like a pretty sophisticated understanding of the human body, as well as how the brain worked with respect to various other organs. And for that, I think that we really need to give him credit. But this raises a lot of really troubling issues for Descartes. Namely, like how, for example, does the mind produce these electrical signals? And this is going to be exactly the sort of problem that's brought up by the second author that we're going to be examining, Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia. Now, Princess Elisabeth is an extraordinarily interesting philosophical figure in her own right, although she didn't write any big books like Descartes did. Elisabeth is a philosophically inclined princess, and her kingdom is not really doing well. She's kind of depressed. She's reading a lot of philosophy. She read Descartes' Meditations with great interest and wanted to start a correspondence with Descartes. And she kind of has this attitude of like, oh, Descartes, please excuse me. I am, but a lowly woman, and I'm trying my best to understand your doctrines, but I don't quite get it. Would you please be so kind as to please explain these various aspects of your view to me? And it turns out that Descartes was very impressed with Elisabeth. I mean, it's really, I think, quite revealing about his character that he was like normally a pretty cold and dispassionate person, but with Princess Elisabeth, he is encouraging and warm. He tells her, for example, that she's understood him better than other people have understood him, and he tries really hard to help her get out of her depression. They start thinking about emotions, and they turn to a lot of sources in ancient Greek Stoic philosophy in order to kind of think through these issues. And that raises a totally other interesting can of worms about Descartes' relation to Stoicism as a philosophy that we can't get into for this moment. Nevertheless, despite Princess Elisabeth's doubts, I think it is generally agreed upon by most philosophers nowadays that Princess Elisabeth really discovered an absolutely damning objection to Descartes' philosophical system that really motivates a lot of approaches that are taken within philosophy of mind today. So her work really is still relevant and really shows the shortcomings of Descartes, who is himself, at least on my account, a sort of towering figure, especially in the philosophy of mind. And we can get a sense of her question to Descartes through this quote I have written here. She asks, "How can the soul of a man determine the bodily spirits to make voluntary actions, the soul being only a thinking substance?" So in other words, this is the question that I was just raising a moment ago. If the mind is not material, it has no material component whatsoever, it does not belong, strictly speaking, within the material world, how is it located in the pineal gland, and how is it able to then send out signals from the pineal gland to various other aspects of the body? Now, Descartes' reply to Elisabeth is in some ways philosophically dissatisfying. Ultimately, what Descartes says is at the bottom here. He says that we have a clear knowledge of the difference between the mind and body, but we have an unclear idea of their connection. So in other words, we viscerally feel the connection between our mind and our body, but we don't have the available cognitive tools to understand it. And so Descartes, in essence, I think you could say, gives a cop-out answer. He tries to say that I don't need to explain the specifics of how the mind and the body interact at that level, such that the mind, which is an immaterial being, produces a material force, namely an electric signal, and, that's that. Now, he does respect Princess Elisabeth a lot, and he tries to answer her questions about the nature of what he would call passions, or what we would now call emotions, right? The way that our body can sometimes feel, which then has an effect on our mind. So he tries to answer her question, but I think that most scholars would agree that he doesn't really get very far. It's just very, very difficult to explain how it is that an immaterial being can produce anything like a material force. Princess Elisabeth is also really interesting because the direction that she suggests would make more sense for Descartes is, in fact, I think, a much more prominent view within philosophy of mind today. She says that it would be easier to understand the nature of this connection if we could conceive of the mind as a physical thing. So, Elisabeth perhaps wants to think of the mind as a physical thing that also thinks, right? Perhaps to close the gap that Descartes has opened between the mind and the brain, to somehow explain how it is that the brain is the mind, rather than the brain is the house of the mind, as in Descartes. Now we get an entirely different kind of objection from Anton Wilhelm Amo, who is himself like a very interesting figure. He wrote almost a century later than Descartes in response to both Descartes as well as some philosophical systems that took inspiration from Descartes. But I think that his objection at its core really strikes at this aspect of Cartesian philosophy, namely its account of what Amo calls the apathy of the human mind, or how the human mind comes to be affected by the physical world, right? You can think of apathy as like indifference, right? So the mind is indifferent as to whether or not some physical object exists, but then has a sensation, right? Comes to be affected by the world has a causal impact on the mind, and then, the mind comes to be affected and therefore change itself, right? To get out of this state of apathy. Now, Amo's biography is also really interesting. Amo is the only African philosopher that we are going to discuss this semester. He was raised in a European context. It was kind of part of some weird racist Enlightenment experiment to determine if an African could become sort of like an enlightened philosopher if they were like given the appropriate education and so on. That is intensely racist, right? To essentially kidnap a child and raise them as I said, a kind of philosophical experiment. It's a very, very bad thing. And Amo was a professor, actually, at some German universities before he eventually left and returned to Ghana. We know very little of what happened after this point, but I think it's hard for us not to think about this as essentially the good ending, right? The happy ending is that Amo gets to go back to Africa and escape his European captors. Now, Amo's argument, in essence, is he wants to say that on Descartes' account, bodies don't sense things, right? Bodies are just affected. They're governed, as we said in the last video, entirely by efficient causal relationships. So the sort of things that physics studies, right? How far you can throw a ball, or what the velocity of a ball will be rolling down a hill, and so on. These sort of predictable physical interactions are what takes place within bodies. The mind, then, on Descartes' account, is the one that actually interprets this information that's provided to it, and in a way makes it make sense, right? Interprets it as a sensory perceptual world, right? So in essence, in Descartes, the mind perceives things, the body doesn't perceive things. It's just affected by stuff and then communicates how it's affected to the brain that then interprets things. Now, Amo thinks that this view is wrong, and he thinks it's wrong because he wants to say that sensation and sensory perception are physical processes. And if they're physical processes, then they are processes that belong, strictly speaking, to the body. Here's a quote from Amo. Amo says, "Human beings sense material things not with the mind, but with a living, organic body," right? The process of sensory perception is a process of life, in a process that takes place in a biological, organic context. If you want to know more about how humans perceive things, you should look at specific features of the human eye. For example, the rods and cones in the human eye that determine, for example, our color perception and so on. You can't learn anything about how we, for example, have visual representations purely by examining the content of your own mind. Similarly, if you want to know about auditory experiences, then you should study the ears, especially the inner ears and its relationship to the brain. These are physical processes, not mental processes. And so Amo, like Elisabeth, points in the direction of a broadly physicalist picture of the philosophy of mind. They would want to push against some of Descartes' more extreme claims about the immateriality of the body, and instead point out its essential relationship to a living, organic, human body. Now, I'm very interested to know what you think. Do you tend to agree more with Descartes in his belief of the strict division between minds and bodies and their causal interactions? Or do you tend to agree with Princess Elisabeth and Amo as their sort of physicalist/materialist sort of critics who want to say that the mind actually is more of a physical process than Descartes' account can show us? Thanks so much for being here. I look forward to talking with you all in the next video.